So without further ado, let's get into this concept here. Like I said, about the counting of souls, the counting of individuals, the census, the birth records, the death records. Everybody mentions this, talks about it as part of the control grid. And it is. I mean, that's, without dispute. But we're going to talk about the roots of it, and let's get into it.
Yes, we started off with the Poor Relief Act in late 1600s, and we're going to go on now to the Cestui-Que-Vie Act. A lot of people talk about this because it's a trust, and it's about estates, and it's basically how we were incorporated into an estate to be turned into what is called a legal fiction. So in other words, for anything to be conveyed in law, it has to be property. So we're going to talk tonight also about the so-called Admiralty law, the Admiralty courts. And I've done some research and found the documents that link that way back to what is going on now with county courts. These courts were always courts of administration, and they are courts of salvage and property. And that's going to be very important with what we're going to talk about tonight. But a lot of people talk about the Cestui-Que-Vie Act of 1666. And it basically means remaining beyond the sea for 7 years and with no proof of your life. And you're judged in action to direct a verdict as though you were dead. So after 7 years, you were pronounced lost at sea. Now, it looks as though what's happened, and we can go into the statutes going up to the 1800s. I've got a lot of these, the Birth, Deaths and Registrations Act, etc. It appears that we were turned into property. And I'll just go through the Cestui-Que-Vie Act of 1666. This is an updated version of the Cestui-Que-Vie Act of 1540. And I'll read it out quite slowly because it's very, very important to grasp what this is about. It says, if such person or persons for whose life or lives such estates have been or shall be granted as aforesaid shall remain beyond the sea or elsewhere, absent themselves in this realm by the space of 7 years together, and not sufficient and evident proof be made of the lives of such person or persons respectively in any action commenced for recovery of such tenements by the lessors or reversioners, in every such case the person or persons upon whose life or lives such estate depended shall be accounted as naturally dead. And in every action brought for the recovery of the said tenements by the lessors or reversioners, their heiresses or assignees, the judges before whom such action shall be brought shall direct the jury to give their verdict as if the person so remaining beyond the sea or otherwise absenting himself were dead. So that gives the courts a clause there, a get-out clause, to assume that you are property, which is going to make it much easier for them when you go into administrative court. And I wanted also to go into this Admiralty business because people talk about Admiralty law. Now, right. I did some research on this, and the courts have been using Admiralty law since 1290. And I found a book which was the history of the Admiralty courts. And this is going back to the Middle Ages, and it says, various devices consisting chiefly of legal fictions were employed in the common law courts to enable them to adjudicate maritime matters actually within the Admiralty jurisdiction. But when retaliation in kind was attempted by the civilians in the Admiralty court, they were thwarted by common law writs of prohibition. What they're doing there is they're bringing the law of the sea, the law of merchants, into courts on the land. And the laws of the sea are about salvage and property. We've talked about the birth certificate being birthed going into the dock. There's an article on windowsontheworld.net, and it's called, Is a Birth Certificate a Death Certificate? And that ties into what we've just been saying about the presumption of death after 7 years. It appears at some point that this was changed. It's very, very difficult to find out quite where it was done. Now, that sounds a bit vague, but it appears that in these Admiralty courts, which are now county courts, we were proclaimed to be salvage a long time ago, as I said, as long as 1290. So let's go into what the birth certificate does, because the birth certificate is that certificate of lading. It's basically when you go into the dock under Admiralty law, then your birth certificate is docked, and the harbour master, the judge, wants to know what's on board. But it all goes back to this assumption of property. Now, only an inanimate thing can be property, so we're not property. I think we discussed this before. We're divine human beings, but under this system, only property can be conveyed. For instance, if you buy a house, you buy the title. You don't own the house. You can never own anything. If you've got a car, you don't own the car, because you fill in a thing in the UK called a V5 document, which is a trust document. So you fill that in and you agree to the rules of the trust. So you are then a trustee, and you have to carry out what the executor, which is the driver and vehicle licensing agency under the Crown, wants you to do. And of course, if you don't pay your tax on your car, they will take it, because it's not yours, it's theirs. That's why they can take your car and crush it, because it's not yours. You have use of it. It's property which you have an agreed use of. To keep it simple for today, it all goes back to this assumption, the birth certificate. Let's get into the birth certificate, the Registration of Births, Deaths and Marriages Act, which requires a registered birth to be recorded and witnessed by the informant, your parent. Remember, your parents informed on you. They were informants. They gave the Crown the information that a new revenue stream had been born, which was you.
Right.
And there's a registrar there to register that birth in a parish, and then it goes on to the Gazette. The registration of the birth name gives the child its title, its legal name, so it can operate in commerce. That's the legal fiction, the legal title. The registration turns the child into a thing on a register, and that's very important, because when your name's on paper, it's your legal fiction, it's not you. And there's a huge confusion when people go, well, it's not me. Well, it is you, and it's not you. And if you don't want it to be you, then don't go to court. But what they'll do is they'll do a judgment in your absence, because they don't need you there. And that's the thing that many people have a problem with. And we've tried it in court. We've had the police called. It's been hilarious and quite scary at times. But all this stuff was experimental when we didn't really understand the true fraud of what was going on. Because when people like councils just issue these liabilities, we just thought, oh, that's because they can do it. And they can, because they're the parish council. But when it gets into massive fraud, which is what's happened, it's totally different. It's quite mind-blowing. So this birth certificate, again, is the root of all that. It's your route into commerce. So this thing, you, can be conveyed lawfully and in commercial agreements between parties. That's what the birth certificate's for. The legal title means the child is the property of the state and not the parent, which is why the social services can come and take the child, because it doesn't belong to the parent. If there's a controversy and the social services believe or imply that their property is not being looked after, they're going to take it back. And that's why people's children get taken away. Again, it comes down to registration. The lost at sea rule, as we've stated, meant that after 7 years, the person, the property, was unclaimed and was missing, presumed dead. And in order to take full advantage of the person as a traded commodity in the 17 to 1800s, everyone registered at birth was considered lost at sea, so as to be traded before the age of 7. Now, a lot of this happened. It came out of Westminster Palace, which was the home of the statutes, and which was burned in 1834. And over 95% of statutes came into force between 1835 and 1899. The birth certificate became a death certificate as the registered person was presumed dead, as they provided no rebuttal to this assumption. We've been through that. The death certificate can be charged against an estate, which is obviously what they're doing with the birth certificate, but they're making up a fictional estate there. In commercial law, the law of the civil court and admiralty, all fines and fees are paid from the estate of the deceased or living person, doesn't matter, without recourse. This is done by means of an order or writ. This is because an estate cannot be charged unless it is in probate. Again, we're going back to the death thing here. In civil and now quasi-criminal matters, though, all persons are dealt with as though in bankruptcy using foreclosure. The estate is administered in bankruptcy. The person is assumed, therefore, to be delinquent and an imbecile and therefore has no rights, which is how this massive fraud can happen. And that's quite important. And of course, the birth certificate is a blood bond, and it signs over the person to the state, which could be the devil. The blood of the baby is taken at birth. And this is very important as well, Chuck. It is a blood bond because the Guthrie card was brought in 1962, but they were doing it way before that. And they're taking a spot of the child's blood. And this can also be done by the vitamin K test, where they cut the baby's heel. Now, the reason they're doing that is they're building up a DNA database. There's something else deeper going on with blood groups, and we can get into that maybe in the future, but that's something that I've looked into. Came across a bit of a brick wall on, but very important. That's one of the reasons why the blood is taken. Well, that's a much, much bigger picture that we can't get into tonight. So
no,
overall,
there's a scientific, a mystical, and a symbolic religious cause for that thing. I mean, there are so many facets to the blood bond that yeah, I think we would devote an entire hour to the blood bond, actually.
Yeah, we could too.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Yes. And looking back on the free man thing, because this is very important to a lot of people, because there's still people getting into a lot of trouble with the free man thing, quite unnecessarily, really. But we've been through the legal fiction, and we've been through the benefits of the name, and we saw that documents were being circulated to the courts, how to deal with free man on the land. And basically they were saying you don't have to engage with them at all, that you don't have to say anything, their arguments have no merit, etc. So they've shut down a lot of that. But I think the reason it was shut down was not because of people shouting in court, I'm not the legal fiction. It was because of something else. It was because uncovering massive fraud and the stealing of property. So what they did very cleverly was a number of us were going into court competently when property had been stolen through fake county court warrants and tracking it. And this took a few years to find out how it was done. Problem is, it's done with the complicity of the county court. Well, we're talking about privateers here. We're talking about a court of salvage. It's not changed since 1290. So there's no surprise that they're still doing it. But what they've done now is that the fraud has got worse because the fraudulent paperwork is being generated within the county court by the staff there. And these court cases are being heard in the county court, but there's no court reference for them. The numbers don't exist. But the high courts, some of them are aware of this. And what's happened is, to shut people down who are competent, they're now labelling everyone free man on the land. And that, I think, was the idea from the start. I personally believe now that the free man thing was set up as a carrot dangling exercise to put people in slightly the wrong direction, but then be able to shut down anybody else. There are remedies outside of that, but
okay.
That, I think, was a big thing. It's happened to several people I know, and looking back on it, that does seem to be the case. So the free man thing is quite interesting. It started off with a very, very interesting premise, but I think if it started off, and I think it was a genuine thing to start with people like Rob Menard, I think it was genuine, but I think it got hijacked very quickly. And we went along with a lot of those principles, and we had a lot of fun doing it, but it didn't really solve anything. So basically, this thing is very interesting. We did a film. It's called Councils, Courts and Con Men. That's in an article actually on Windows on the World called Freeman versus Legal Fiction, and there's some very, very interesting stuff in that. What I wanted to get onto, because I know we haven't got much time left, is that there is a reality to this legal fiction. There is a reality to the fact we're traded.
Right.
I was given several years ago access to get into Fidelity Investments in America as a trader.
Okay.
A trading account searching for mutual fund. And I was told to put my name and date of birth in. And it wasn't just me. 3 of us did it. And we all came up with bonds. And that was Maryland Municipal Income Fund, bond number 429 with a QSIP number. Now, I tried putting in different names and nothing came up. So from that, I'm pretty sure that that's how they're doing it. And when I looked into this, the birth certificates were originally stored at Greenwich Hospital, Admiralty Arch, funnily enough, the home of Admiralty, and transferred to Maryland. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
Well, it is strange, and I've often heard about this concept that every one of us, in the Americas anyway, who ends up, or on this side of the pond, let's just say, who has one of these things we call a Social Security number, realistically, that is a key code to get at the tradable commodity that we actually are, which is fascinating.
I've got a really funny one there, Chuck, because a friend of mine did it. You know, all this thing about let's claim our birth bonds back. My friend went through the whole UCC form filling, incredibly complicated and laborious system of claiming the name and claiming the estate, and he got a letter from the IRS in America saying that it was a crime not to fill in a tax return in America. Which I thought was hilarious. So he's gone to claim his bond, and he's been told that he's now under threat of prison if he doesn't pay his taxes in America.
Which is really funny because
it's great, isn't it?
Well, and you know what's hysterical about that is realistically there is no law that exists to compel you to pay the federal income tax, believe it or not.
That's right. That's exactly right.
If you don't believe me, call up an IRS representative and please tell them. They'll tell you Section 32C, whatever, of the IRS code. That's what they will tell you. But ask them for the law, the actual law. There is none. So they're threatening him with punishment over a law that doesn't exist, which is nice because he's part of a compulsory code, which, to the best of my knowledge, only affects individuals who are allegedly living here in the United States. And meanwhile, where does your friend live?
In the UK.
Okay, just checking. I thought that's what I understood, but
yeah, that was what's funny about it.
Hysterical. That's hysterical.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, they've got all angles covered, you see. I mean, that's the thing. It's only business after all. And looking at this in retrospect, it is incredibly funny. Going into a court, saying, I'm not the legal fiction, putting a birth certificate in the dock. It's completely puzzling to magistrates. It's incredibly funny. I mean, we had the police called on us. It was funny. The police were kind of on our side. And then there was a sergeant who was on the side of the magistrates. So there was a standoff, not just between us and the police, but between the police who were with us and the sergeant. So it was really funny. And I think the police enjoyed it. They all came in sweating with tasers into the court. And there was nothing happening. We just all sat there. And I think they had a really good afternoon. But all this stuff ultimately doesn't solve anything. What really solves things is people, as we said, becoming competent in the system, or better still, bartering and keeping authorities out of your business.
Welcome to Windows on the World. I'm Mark Windows. Now, over the years, we've put out a lot of information. The Windows on the World show has run for several years now. We've exposed corruption, found solutions, and put out some very useful information on many subjects since we started doing this. This includes, of course, the bigger picture, along with well-researched history, science, and, of course, health matters, which we also cover. Now, our initial website was landofthefree.co.uk, and this was set up to fight the corporate courts, rogue bailiffs, and the unlawful actions of public officials. I and many others have successfully fought criminal bailiff companies and won in court against dishonest councils. This information is all still available. The journalistic integrity of Windows on the World is very important, and we try to put out information that's forensically accurate and simplistic as possible. So we try and put everything out in a very easy way for people to understand, because over the years there's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation, especially with where people stand within the law, and it's got a lot of people into trouble. So we've always stayed on the right side of the law, but being able to empower people to go into court and do the right thing, that's very important to us. Now, I put this information out to the public because I feel it needs to be there. And even within so-called alternative media, there is much information which is misleading and incorrect. In fact, all the things the now ridiculous mainstream media accuses the alternative media of, there are people putting out stuff that's very, very unhelpful, and we try not to do that. So we accept no funding from anybody and are completely independent. And it's now increasingly necessary that we get some help to fund what we're doing. We're looking for sponsors from self-employed small business sector, which, as we know, is being destroyed, and we cover this a lot on the show with the plans for regeneration, the soaring business rates, and the destruction of what we used to know as our environment, because we're finding that people now are being pushed out and socially engineered from the places that they need to be. We'd also like to appeal to individuals who might be able to donate. Now, the donate button on the site, you can just scroll down to the bottom of the page, and it's also on every article and every video on the site, on windowsontheworld.net. Now, I've never asked for any donations before, but things are getting a bit tighter for us, and we want to carry on and expand what we're doing. That's the most important thing, to expand what we're doing and be able to bring you much more information, which is very difficult at the moment because there's just a few of us. So, the bottom line is, if you can spare a few quid and enjoy what we're doing, press the donate button, we'll be very grateful. And if there's anybody out there, small businesses, who benefit from the sort of information that we put out, and we know there's quite a few because we've been contacted by them, if you'd like to make a small contribution or help out in any way, we'd be most grateful. That's the end of that, and we'll see you soon on Windows on the World.